Yo, Headliner Nation, what is going on? Your boy Kyle back with Week 9 research on dem ball catchers. We've got some wide receiver start and sit analysis for you that we're going to dive into, help you get your lineups ready to set for the coming week. And then, of course, hopefully everybody is doing, great with their lineups as it is. Hopefully we're either already locking up a playoff spot or moving towards locking up a playoff spot. We're just at this point, a few weeks away from starting the playoffs in most leagues. So let's hope that we're all getting ready to dominate the playoffs and bring home fantasy football championships. But enough of all that, let's hop into it. We're going to kick off our analysis on Thursday Night Football. Going to be Philadelphia and Houston this week. Houston currently allows the 6th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, which might be a little interesting for you to hear, but probably some of that is because teams run on them a little bit more because of the score of the games. So right now, Houston not giving up a whole lot of fantasy points, but listen, it's Philadelphia. They're coming off a huge game. A.J. Brown, 3 touchdowns. But the one thing about Philadelphia is I want everyone to keep in mind is they put up about 3/4 of their fantasy output in the first half of football games. Because once they get to the second half of football games, they've got a huge lead. A majority of the time, they're running the football a little bit more, slowing things down. At the beginning of the game, they're really amping it up. They're trying to score points and put points up on you fast. So that's the one thing. Like what you see from the first half of games, a lot of times is really what you're mostly going to get. So just keep that in mind throughout the game. If you're kind of keeping an eye on Thursday Night Football, that a lot of points could come early in this game, especially against Houston. If we're up on Houston big at halftime, probably not going to see a whole lot of throwing the football in the second half. For Houston, though, really hard to figure out what's going to happen with anything right now. Philadelphia, obviously, great defense, allows the 8th fewest fantasy points per game to wide receivers. Nico Collins still isn't practicing. And what is going on with Brandon Cooks? So there was lots of talk about him potentially being traded. And it looked like he was looking for that to happen as well, because some of the tweets he's put out since the trade deadline has passed is very interesting. He wasn't at practice on Monday or Tuesday. Obviously, during this recording, we haven't heard about Wednesday practice yet, but I'm not going with anybody in Houston right now outside of like a Dameon Pierce, just because I don't really know what's going on with them, and it just doesn't look good. The LA Chargers and Atlanta could bring a huge matchup for the Chargers. Right now, Atlanta allows the 2nd most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. It's a really good matchup, and hopefully coming out of the bye, Keenan Allen is feeling even more healthy at this point and really kind of back to 100% now. No Mike Williams also means that he's going to be the number 1 for sure. Palmer's kind of a high-risk start for me. Now, definitely going to roll with Keenan Allen this week. I like him. The matchup is good enough to start him, so I'm going to start him this week. Palmer's a little bit more of kind of a last resort type of start for me. The upside is definitely there, but he's a lot riskier for me because I still think Gerald Everett is going to be a really nice start, a really safe start based on the numbers that we're seeing from him and his potential matchup. And for the Atlanta side, you just can't trust anybody right now. That's the bad part about this. Cordero Patterson could be back. Drake London hasn't gotten very many targets. Zacchaeus isn't getting very many targets. They're running the football an awful lot. Probably going to run the football even more with Patterson coming back. So for me right now, Kyle Pitts is the number 1 in this offense, and even he is up and down at this point. So wide receiver wise, I think we kind of need to be off London for a while and wait to see what happens rest of season. Miami at Chicago, there's some really interesting things to watch here, and I'm kind of excited for this game. Chicago allows the 4th fewest fantasy points to wide receivers, but that was pre-trade of Quinn and Smith. Both of those guys are gone now. What does that mean on the defensive side of the ball? I still think Miami has an opportunity to come out here and smack Chicago around a little bit. And my prize picks prop to play this week is going to be Jalen Waddle, and I'm going to take the over of 70.5 receiving yards. That feels like an absolute smash play to me for Jalen Waddle. I like his opportunity. Again, this defense is going to be a little bit different, not creating the same type of pressure that they would have if they had Quinn and Smith. And because of that, Waddle, a guy winning over the middle. Roquan Smith is a guy that even kind of drops back in coverage sometimes. Not having him in the middle of the field is going to make a lot of difference for Jalen Waddle as well. And then on the Chicago side of it, Miami allows the 10th most fantasy points to wide receivers. I would love love to play Chase Claypool. Don't get me wrong, but I'm going to wait this week because I want to see how he fits into the system. What does he do this week? How do they utilize him? Does he have a full snap count? Things of that nature. But even if he's out there, half the snaps or something like that, this is really good for Darnell Mooney. I think it's going to help open up some things for him because I think Claypool's going to start to see a little bit more of that wide receiver one coverage. So Mooney is going to be a start for me this week. It's a pretty good matchup for him. Justin Fields is playing really well right now. The ground game with Justin Fields running it is starting to kind of open things up a little bit. So the addition of Chase Claypool is only good for Mooney. Now, when it comes to Dante Pettis, he's not safe enough to start for me, but he's a guy that's been getting some looks in the red zone. So if he were to score this week, I wouldn't be surprised. Carolina and Cincinnati, and welcome back, DJ Moore. Over the last 2 weeks, he's top 5 in targets, top 5 in receptions, top 5 in receiving yards. And oh, by the way, he's the wide receiver too. We're going to keep rolling him out there. DJ Moore looking really good right now. Tougher matchup against Cincinnati. That defense has done a pretty good job of limiting big plays and wide receivers this season. But again, just based on all the volume DJ Moore is getting right now, we're absolutely looking his way. And then for the Cincinnati Bengals, Carolina is now allowing 28.8 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. They were looking really good at the beginning of the season. They're kind of starting to fall off a little bit though. They're allowing the 6th most fantasy points to wide receivers over the last 4 weeks. Cincinnati did struggle last week on offense, and don't get me wrong, T. Higgins still scored, but it was one big play that saved his day, and outside of one touchdown from Tyler Boyd, he didn't really do anything either. So, Hayden Hurst didn't really do anything. Joe Mixon didn't really do anything, but this is another good matchup here. Hopefully, whatever it was that was holding him back last week, we'll get him on board, and we'll see big games from Higgins and Boyd. Green Bay and Detroit, and this could be the game, and I know I've said this a couple of different times, that really gets Green Bay back on track. Detroit is allowing the 6th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. They did look a lot better. Yeah, they had obviously big games to Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle last week, but nobody's stopping those guys. They looked a little bit better against Dallas a couple of weeks ago. Dobbs had a nice bounce back performance last week. We'll see if Lazard can get healthy and get back out there this week, but this is a really good matchup for both of those guys. So if Lazard does play this week, he's a start for me. If he doesn't, that's just a little bit of a better opportunity from Dobbs, but I'm probably going to list him as a high-risk start anyway this week. For Amon-Ra St. Brown, the extra targets are going to be available now that TJ Hockenson is gone. It's a tough matchup for Reynolds. He could end up seeing a little bit more Jair Alexander. We kind of saw it last week where Alexander was on Gabe Davis on the outside quite a bit. He didn't really float to the inside when Stephon Diggs would go to the inside. So I have a feeling that he's probably not going to be on Amon-Ra St. Brown too much this week. Khalif Raymond could also be an interesting option. If Josh Reynolds ends up seeing the majority of Jair Alexander this week, then Khalif Raymond could end up being a guy that in very deep leagues, like 14, 16 teams, multiple flex leagues, that if you're looking for an emergency option, maybe he helps out. Not really banking on that at all, but my money is on Amon-Ra St. Brown to really have one of those big weeks that we saw at the beginning of the season. Las Vegas and Jacksonville, and it's going to be very hard to trust Las Vegas right now after last week. So I'm going to skip on Renfrow, going to skip on Hollins. Right now, Hunter Renfrow is basically a drop for me. The dude hasn't really done anything, and it's very disappointing to see because he was such a great, prominent presence in this lineup last year and in this offense, and he's completely fallen off. And I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's just because the addition of Devontae Adams has things a little bit off right now, if Carr's trying to look Adams' way too much. I don't really know why that is, especially since Darren Waller has been banged up. But even Matt Collins has been a guy that's made more of a fantasy impact than Hunter Renfrow has this year, which is very disappointing. But we'll go back with Devontae Adams, and we're still keeping an eye on Darren Waller. And then Christian Kirk, for me, he's like having the most silent wide receiver 14 season I've ever seen in my entire life. Like, it doesn't feel like we're ever talking about him. Yeah, he is a little bit more dependent on those big plays. As you can see, production at a 4, volume at a 3, so he's not getting nearly as many targets as he is the production coming from it. But if ETN continues to be a beast on the ground, that's going to open up things in the passing game. This is an okay matchup. So hopefully at this point we start to see a few more targets go Christian Kirk's way, but he's going to be a start for me this week, and we're going to keep our fingers crossed that he does hit that big play. Indianapolis and New England is really interesting for me because people just seem to be completely off Michael Pittman Jr., and it makes no sense to me. He is still top 12 in the league right now in targets per game at the wide receiver position. Last week, if you look at what Ellinger wasn't bad last week. He wasn't. He was pretty good. He wasn't great, but he did just enough. He had that one fumble, and other than that, didn't really make a whole lot of mistakes. And guess what? He gave Michael Pittman 9 targets, which was by far the most on the team last week. He is the wide receiver 1 on this team. He's still seeing targets. He's producing. Last week, he caught 7 of those and only had like 59 receiving yards. But again, as we see Ehlinger kind of get more, comfortable in the offense and starting, things are going to start to open up a little bit more. And Pittman's going to be a guy that's going to have a good rest of the season. I'm still trying to buy low on Michael Pittman. He's a start for me this week. And for the New England Patriots, Indianapolis is allowing the second fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Devontae Parker, keeping an eye on him. He may miss this week. They said that even if he were to miss this week, it's kind of a short-term injury. So if he does end up missing this week, Tyquan Thornton is going to be a guy that we'll keep an eye on because they might need to utilize him a little bit and some of that craftiness that we saw a few weeks ago where they do some different things with him and allow him to kind of be that weapon that we've seen other offenses utilize. Jakobi Meyers, even in a tougher matchup, will be a start for me, though, just because he's gotten so much volume and production this year. We got to keep going back to him. Buffalo and the New York Jets. And this week, believe it or not, Gabe Davis is not going to be an automatic lock for me. I mean, this is going to be a tougher matchup against the New York Jets. They do a very good job of limiting wide receiver points. So if we don't get the big score from Gabe Davis this week, we're probably not going to get anything. Proceed with caution with Gabe Davis this week. Obviously, Stefon Diggs is going to be a start. But for me with Gabe Davis, if there's safer options out there, I probably roll with the safer option. And if for some reason Davis does have a big day, we just know that based on the numbers and based on the research, we knew that if he scored, it would be a good day. But if he didn't, it would be a tough day. Now for the New York Jets, no one's going to be a start for me. I mean, Corey Davis has been banged up. Elijah Moore has disappeared. Garrett Wilson did have a good week last week. Don't get me wrong. It was good to see that, but we're going up against the Buffalo Bills. Yeah, they'll be throwing it quite a bit, but do the Jets come out and maybe try to run the football more and try to contain that part of the game to keep Josh Allen, the offense, off the field as much as possible? I'm really weary about trying to start Garrett Wilson this week. Minnesota and Washington is going to bring you my Manscaped must-watch matchup of the week. Head on over to manscaped.com if you're looking for any Christmas presents, stocking stuffers, looking to just treat your significant other to a little surprise. When you fill up your cart, use code word headliners. You're going to get 20% off your entire order and free shipping at manscaped.com. Minnesota and Washington. Both of these teams are in the top 8 of most fantasy points per game allowed to wide receivers. Justin Jefferson's going to be a lock start for me this week. Adam Thielen, hopefully he sees a good game this week. With TJ Hockenson being newer to the team, I don't see much of a fantasy impact for him. Should still set Adam Thielen up for success this week. And Taylor Heinicke loves himself from some Terry McLaurin. I mean, I said it last week, right? I was listing him as a sit, and I said I wouldn't be surprised if I got burned on this one because Heinicke loves himself some Terry McLaurin. McLaurin goes out and has an excellent day. He's going to be back on the start column for me this week. Curtis Samuel doesn't have a whole lot of upside for me. He's a very risky start. But again, given the matchup and knowing that Minnesota gives up quite a few fantasy points to wide receivers, Curtis Samuel could find himself just slipping into that double-digit range for fantasy points. Seattle at Tampa Bay, and let's just take a moment to just think about how should we put this? Unreal, unhuman, insane DK Metcalf is. I mean, this is a dude that people thought, he's going to have surgery, to not having any surgery, might just be out to a couple of weeks, to going out and scoring touchdowns. Absolutely insane. DK and Lockett are both going to be locks in my lineup this week. Going up against Arizona. For Arizona, Seattle is allowing the third fewest fantasy points to wide receivers. So Rondale Moore, coming off of a huge game last week, he's going to be a sit for me again this week, knowing that it might be a tougher matchup. But DeAndre Hopkins is, based on fantasy points and production, the best wide receiver in football his first 2 weeks back. He looks absolutely excellent. And even though he's not that big field stretcher that we've seen at times over the course of his career, he's still an amazing possession receiver. He can go up and get the football, runs great routes, all of those things as well. Still playing very, very well. DeAndre Hopkins is going to be a lock, even with the tougher matchup. For the LA Rams in Tampa Bay, we are going to have to monitor Cooper Kupp's ankle injury throughout the week. Now, he's only considered day-to-day, and based on what Sean McVay has said, it is not a serious injury. So if Kupp ends up playing, good. We're going to put him in our lineup. If he doesn't play, though, then Allen Robinson at that point may end up becoming a start. Tampa Bay's defense is hurting right now. Barrett suffering that injury last week that ended his season. Van Jefferson, he's a guy that maybe watch for that deep play this week now that he's back. Hopefully they get him a little bit more integrated. But for now, Cooper Kupp will be a start for me. And then for Tampa Bay, Evans and Chris Godwin, they're going to be starts. I mean, they're both seeing a ton of volume, right? When you take a look at the numbers, both of them are top 24 in terms of most targets per games among wide receiver. Mike Evans is top 12 among production per game with wide receivers. Now, Chris Godwin's is significantly lower, and that's because he's not scoring a whole lot of touchdowns right now. But again, the volume is there, the targets are there, and sometimes we just need to chase the targets, and we'll end up finding the production at some point. Tennessee and Kansas City, and this would be a great matchup for Robert Woods. Kansas City is allowing the third most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. But for me, when you take a look at it, I can't start Robert Woods this week, even in a matchup that is this good, even in a matchup that says, hey, we've got to put him out there. I can't, because they just haven't done anything. Now, Malik Willis getting the start again this week wasn't great last week, but it's going to be kind of the same thing this week, where they try to run the football as much as possible with Derrick Henry, but they're going to have to throw it at some point. But who's really going to get it? Robert Woods hasn't done anything. So if you're going to start Robert Woods this week, for me, you're starting Robert Woods in an absolutely emergency situation only. And if that is the case, I would even try to look and see if there's guys out there that have a little bit more upside than what Robert Woods has. Now, for Kansas City, I'm not going to add Toney to this list yet. Kadarius Toney will end up finding his list on some point this season, I'm sure, and will knock off MVS or Hardman at some point. But Tennessee does allow the fourth most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, and that's why I'll go back to Juju this week. He's heating up right at the right time. Got an awesome matchup, looking really good with Patrick Mahomes as of recent. I think that continues this week. Maybe we'll get a little bit of glimpse of what they'll be doing with Kadarius Toney, but not really enough for me to put him into my lineups as of yet. Our last matchup of the week is going to be Monday Night Football. Baltimore going to head to New Orleans. We're going to add Demarcus Robinson to the list here, knowing that Rashad Bateman is now going to be missing multiple weeks. Now, you heard me talk a moment ago about a guy like Kadarius Toney and Robert Woods, guys that I'm not super excited about this week. I'm going to be honest with you. On the road against New Orleans, a team that, is a pretty good matchup for wide receivers so far this season, I would go with a Demarcus Robinson before I would go over either of those guys. All right. So Demarcus Robinson is a guy that, even though he's listed as a sit here this week because his fantasy production has basically been nothing so far this season, he is a guy that in your deeper leagues, deep 12 teamers, 14, 16 teamers, multiple flex league, 3 wide receiver leagues, if you're missing a lot of guys this week, Demarcus Robinson is somebody that you could snap up off the waiver wire and could actually get an okay game from this week. Baltimore probably going to be throwing the ball a little bit, but I am going to start the Duve this week because more than likely he'll be seeing a decent amount of targets. And oh, by the way, Mark Andrews is banged up, so we'll even see Mark Andrews this week. On the flip side, Chris Olave will be a start for me. Baltimore allows the 5th most fantasy points to wide receivers this season. 100% going to lock Chris Olave in, seeing the volume, seeing the production. Landry and Thomas, they're both banged up. Who would have guessed Michael Thomas being injured, right? Not us. It wasn't us that told you not to draft him, was it? It wasn't us that told you be careful after he had such a good start to the season. No, it wasn't us. We just did it. But anyway, Chris Olave is healthy. He's in our lineup, and that is going to do it for us here at the Fantasy Headliners in our wide receiver video this week. Hopefully y'all got a ton of information to help you start your lineups or sit your lineups and who you're going to be starting this week. Don't forget to come back on Thursday to check out the rankings videos. Hopefully y'all have a great rest of the week. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll catch y'all in the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.